Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. I'm coming to you from Spokane, Washington, which is located about 300 miles east of Seattle, and our hardiness zone here is roughly 5B to 6A. My husband Bill and I have been gardening in raised beds ever since I first read an article about them way back in 1981. It is a fantastic way to grow vegetables. So that's the topic for today's video. And I've got so much information to share with you, so let's get right to it. This is what started it all. This article ran in Better Homes and Gardens magazine. It was primarily about Peter Chan and his method of growing vegetables in a raised bed garden. It was also about his book, Better Vegetable Gardens the Chinese Way. I ordered the book and knew this was for me. There are so many reasons why raised beds are so wonderful for growing vegetables. For one thing, the sun warms the soil earlier in the spring, and that's because in addition to hitting the surface of the soil, it's also hitting the sides of the bed. Also, the soil stays loose because you're walking around the beds, not right on the soil, which can compress plant roots and then they fail to thrive. Another reason I love raised beds is because I can get off to a faster start in the spring. Instead of needing to prepare the whole garden for planting, I can just pick a bed or two to get some really early crops going, and I'm on my way. It's easier to tend your garden because the beds are up off of the ground. Raised beds can be as tall as you want, and as some of us get older, the idea of taller raised beds sounds very appealing. I also love how quick and easy it is to weed our garden because I only have to weed the surfaces of the beds and that's it. Now, as I'll explain in more detail later, we have landscape fabric under the bark mulch in our pathways. And so if anything does come up in the pathways, which is very rare, I just pull them up because it's a very loose type of a medium. So weeding this entire garden takes me less than an hour. I've found that I can more intensively plant the beds, which means I get higher yields from them. And I really find that a raised bed garden is very aesthetically pleasing to look at. In addition, raised beds are ideal if you have really rocky soil where it's more rocks than soil. You can build a raised bed, fill it with soil, and boom, you've got a garden. And one last thing is that if you have someone in your family who has a disability, and so they're using a walker or a wheelchair, if you make taller raised beds that work well for the height they need to be at, that is a great solution so that they can garden too. One of the reasons raised beds are on my mind right now is because we are in the process of replacing the westernmost row of raised beds. So you'll get to see firsthand the process that we go through to make the beds. So that's coming up. You can create raised beds by building up berms of soil, or you can use some type of framework to create them. For example, you could frame them with wood like we do, or purchase corrugated metal raised beds, although I have to say those are very expensive. Our beds went through a few iterations until we settled on the method we use now. We used a rototiller to create our first raised beds. We had to wait until the soil in the entire garden was dry enough in the spring to till the area. Then I would make a long furrow with the tiller for the first pathway. And at the end of that furrow, I would go about 3 to 4 feet over, make another furrow, and then use an iron rake to level the soil in between those two furrows into raised beds. This whole process was back-breaking work, but it did the job. Unfortunately, I would have to go through this process every year due to soil erosion over the season. For the next version, which started in 1992, we switched to framed raised beds using 1x6 fence boards stacked too high to make roughly 12-inch tall beds. They looked nice at first, and the plants grew great, but those thin boards started warping and cracking. That was a problem. In 1998, we knew we wanted to expand our garden since we were so happy with the raised beds, but decided to switch to 2x10 lumber. What a game changer. The wood held up so much better. We did make a few beds with 2x8s, but I really prefer the deeper beds. I recommend using 2x10s or 2x12s, and we've found that those wooden beds last about 10 to 12 years for us. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things I love about raised bed gardening is that the soil stays loose. And that's because you are walking around the beds rather than across them, which would compact the soil. I recommend 3 to 4 foot wide beds, no wider than that. And they can certainly be as long as you want, depending upon lumber availability, of course. Bill and I prefer to use untreated common lumber such as fir, pine, or larch. I don't trust the materials they use to treat wood, to be honest. We find the beds that are made with untreated lumber last 10 to 12 years, which I mentioned earlier, and I think that's pretty good. I don't recommend using railroad ties even if they're free. They've been treated with creosote, which you don't want contaminating your soil and your veggies. The majority of our beds are 3 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 10 inches high. You can also stack boards to make the beds taller, but you really need to brace them from the inside so they don't split apart on you. We use decking screws to attach the end pieces to the long boards, and that's because nails can pop out of the seams, so I wouldn't recommend using them to construct your bed. And Bill uses a bit of Gorilla Glue just at the corners of the beds, and that's to further secure those 4 seams. Now, first of all, if you thought this row of raised beds was looking fine earlier in this video, check out the rotten board on the right-hand side of this photo. And this was one of the good ones. Yep, time to replace those beds. To make a 3 foot by 8 foot raised bed, we started out with 2 3 foot long boards and 2 8 foot long boards. We also used 3-inch wood construction screws and some Gorilla Glue. Since each bed is quite heavy once it's assembled, we made the beds in the garden so that we would have just a short distance to carry them. Here's my charming and hardworking assistant, Bill. Bill pre-drills 4 screw holes into each end of the 3 foot boards. Then he squirts a line of Gorilla Glue to help strengthen each seam. At that point, he screws the short ends onto the long boards at each of the 4 corners. We had already removed the old boards from a bed and scraped a bit of the soil along the 4 edges to make it easy to put the new bed in place. But that was challenging because some of the soil along the sides was frozen solid. We were careful though. We made sure each bed was level and that they were spaced 3 feet apart for the pathway. Boy, was this a tough job. It took us 2 days to get 4 of the 7 beds replaced. We didn't take all day long doing them, but it was quite a lot of work because of the frozen soil. And now all of the beds are installed. Hooray! We're letting the soil settle for a bit, and then we'll add a bit more as needed. I also wanted to point out that for this new row of beds, the water line pipe is now inside the end of each of the beds. We're going to make 2 new raised bed covers with agricultural insect netting, and this will make it easier to fit them on top of the beds. Stay tuned for that. There are 2 questions that I get asked a lot, having to do with the pathways in our garden and where did we get all of the soil for the beds. And they are interrelated. So for this main part of our garden, because we do have a few more raised beds off camera, we have 3 rows of 7 raised beds each, for a total of 21 raised beds. So within each section of the garden, there's a 3-foot wide path in between each bed. The pathways that go from one row of beds to the next are actually 4 feet wide. And so that gives us the ability to maneuver with wheelbarrows and other types of equipment pretty easily. So if you can make nice sized pathways, I truly recommend that. The other thing is that for the soil in the beds, we knew ahead of time that what we wanted to do for all the pathways to cut down on weeding is we wanted to put down some weed block fabric and then a couple of inches of bark mulch on the top. But we hated to sacrifice all that wonderful topsoil. So before we put anything down on the ground, we went around each of the beds with a shovel and we scraped probably 2 to 3 inches of topsoil from the pathways and put them into each of the beds. And that probably filled the beds about 3/4 of the way already, so that was nice. And then what we did is we bought some composted chicken manure, or we make our own compost, and we added enough to top off the beds. And it's really important not to fill the beds higher than an inch below the lip of the bed. You also want to make sure your beds are level, because when you water them, you don't want the water to wash over the lower side of the bed. So I just wanted to mention that. There's another question that I get asked about a lot, and that is, what are those white pipes on the outsides of your raised beds? I realize they're not exactly aesthetically pleasing, but they serve a very important role because my husband and I are both organic gardeners. If we are growing a crop that's in the cabbage family, such as broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, cauliflower, all of those, or beet family crops, such as beets, spinach, and Swiss chard, we cover the beds with either floating row cover or agricultural insect netting to keep damaging insects away from the plants. So those pipes are 3/4 inch diameter PVC pipes. We've clamped them with a little metal clamp at 2-foot intervals on the outsides of the long boards on the beds. And then we have some leftover drip tubing that fits perfectly into those. And so we made a bunch of hoops, and we can prepare any bed in that way, since I'm always rotating where I grow things. We don't need very many covers in the garden, but those white pipes on the outside make it possible to always do that for any bed. If you have a lot of gophers or voles in your area, or even moles, you might consider putting some 1-inch chicken wire, which is also known as poultry netting, or hardware cloth on the bottoms of the beds before you put them in place and fill them with soil. That way they won't be able to come up on the inside of your bed and eat your veggies. And I should explain that moles are actually carnivorous. They're after insects, not after your plants, but they can really displace the soil with all of their digging. I also wanted to mention that we use drip irrigation to water everything in our garden. And it is a great way to conserve water and deliver water right to the soil surface where the plant's roots can easily take it up. If you look at the right end of the bed, you can see there's a little white and orange valve on it, and that gives us the ability to turn water off if we need to. And all of the drip setups are interchangeable between all of the beds because certain types of crops need more or less water. Our water system is not turned on just yet because it's still too cold here in Spokane, but it will be going on pretty soon. When it comes to accessorizing your raised beds, here's something you might consider doing, and you probably have seen this in other videos of mine, but this is 2 cattle panels side by side that we use to grow winter squash, pumpkins, and other types of vining veggie crops. I also have a tall trellis that is not up yet, but I use that to grow pole beans on. And it is a great way to grow certain types of crops vertically. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover today about raised bed gardening. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me an email at susan@susansinthegarden.com. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. Happy gardening.